In 1989, the world welcomed Sophia Mitchell into a life that, at first glance, appeared ordinary. Growing up in Hartford, Connecticut, Sophia was part of a typical middle-class family. Her father, Richard, a dedicated high school history teacher, and her mother, Martha, a hard-working nurse. From the outside, Sophia's life seemed comfortably predictable. Yet, beneath the surface, she was a girl destined to rise above the expectations set by her small community. Sophia wasn't the only child. Her older brother, Ethan, was 3 years ahead of her and played the role of the protective sibling. Even from a young age, Sophia stood out. Not only was she intellectually sharp, but she also possessed a rare drive to succeed that set her apart from her peers. In school, her talents blossomed, especially in English and debate. Teachers couldn't help but notice her ability to deconstruct complex problems with a clarity beyond her years, offering keen insights that left even adults impressed. Her remarkable gift for argumentation, paired with a calm yet assertive demeanor, allowed her to outshine her classmates, winning school debates with ease. But Sophia's intelligence was more than just academic. She displayed a deep emotional sensitivity, something that often showed through her thoughtful analysis of personal interactions. Her teachers often remarked on how Sophia had an innate ability to read between the lines, sensing motivations and understanding relationships on a level that seemed far beyond her young age. What no one could have predicted was how crucial these traits would become when her life took an unforeseen and life-altering turn years later. However, life wasn't always easy, and Sophia's seemingly perfect childhood began to unravel when she was just 14 years old. It was then that her parents' once stable marriage started to show signs of decay, eventually collapsing into a bitter divorce. Watching her family fall apart left an indelible mark on Sophia's psyche. This emotional upheaval not only exposed her to the fragility of relationships but also planted in her a deep-seated fear of abandonment. Her father, Richard, moved out of the family home, and the once warm and stable environment turned cold. Sophia found herself torn between her parents, each vying for her attention in different ways. Though the divorce was emotionally taxing, Sophia did what she had always done: she channeled her energy into her academics. She developed a fierce resolve to build a future far removed from the chaotic family life she was now forced to navigate. Determined to control her own destiny, Sophia poured herself into her studies, excelling even more. School became her sanctuary, a place where her sharp intellect and love for learning allowed her to momentarily forget the heartache at home. This focus, combined with an unyielding determination, paid off in a big way. Sophia earned a partial scholarship to the prestigious Yale University, a triumph that gave her the opportunity to reinvent herself. Arriving at Yale University, Sophia found herself immersed in a world vastly different from the one she had known. Yale, with its ivy-covered buildings and intellectual rigor, provided a sense of possibility and ambition that she had long yearned for. The bustling campus became the stage for the next chapter of her life, one where she would both academically and personally flourish. Sophia chose to major in communications and minor in psychology, two fields that perfectly suited her natural curiosity about how people interact, both verbally and non-verbally. She was fascinated by the way language could shape perceptions and influence emotions. This passion for understanding human behavior wasn't just an academic pursuit, it was personal. Having witnessed the collapse of her parents' marriage, Sophia was determined to gain insights into how relationships functioned and, more importantly, why they sometimes failed. It was during her sophomore year that Sophia's life took another unexpected turn. At a campus mixer, she met Alexander Brooks, a senior studying business administration. The connection between them was immediate. Alexander was confident, driven, and had an air of ambition that matched Sophia's. He found Sophia's intelligence and sharp wit magnetic, and their shared ambitions quickly deepened their bond. They became inseparable, and soon, their relationship blossomed into something more profound. Alexander, with his natural charisma and strong sense of purpose, complemented Sophia's intellectual depth and emotional intelligence. By the time Sophia graduated, they were already planning their future together. They talked endlessly about their shared dreams, their ambitions, and their desire to build a life together that would surpass anything they had known in their pasts. 2 years after Sophia's graduation, those plans became a reality. In front of their family and friends, they exchanged vows in a stunning ceremony, surrounded by love and optimism for the future. It seemed like the beginning of a beautiful life together, full of promise and shared goals. After the wedding, Sophia's career in marketing took off quickly. She had a natural gift for understanding not just the mechanics of advertising, but the psychology behind consumer behavior. Her campaigns weren't just about selling products, they were about selling ideas, emotions, and connections. By the age of 30, Sophia had climbed the corporate ladder to become a marketing executive at a leading advertising firm in Hartford. Her colleagues admired her not just for her talent, but for her ability to lead with empathy and intelligence. At work, Sophia was respected. At home, she was committed to building the family life she had always dreamed of. Alexander's career as a management consultant required frequent travel, with long business trips that often took him out of town for days or even weeks. At first, Sophia found the distance difficult. She missed having him around, missed the spontaneous dinners and weekend getaways. But as time passed, she grew accustomed to his absences, filling her days with work, yoga classes, and volunteer activities at a local animal shelter. Sophia was determined to maintain a sense of independence, even if Alexander's absence left a gap in their life together. They bought their first home together, a charming 4-bedroom colonial that symbolized the life they envisioned, one filled with children and happy memories. On weekends, when Alexander was home, they would work together to renovate the house, exploring local farmers markets and hosting dinner parties for friends. To anyone on the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple. They laughed together, finished each other's sentences, and shared inside jokes that made others envious of their bond. But behind the scenes, things weren't always as perfect as they appeared. Over time, subtle cracks began to form in their relationship. Alexander's business trips became more frequent and longer in duration, and when he was home, he seemed distracted. He would often check his phone during dinner or step out to take calls in the middle of conversations. Sophia, ever the supportive wife, chalked it up to the demands of his job. She wanted to believe that the stress of his career was the cause of his distant behavior, but a small voice in the back of her mind began to whisper doubts. The first major sign that something was truly wrong came on their 10th wedding anniversary. Alexander, who had always been meticulous about remembering special occasions, completely forgot. He was away on a business trip and didn't even call until late in the evening. When Sophia reminded him of the significance of the day, he was apologetic but detached, his mind seemingly elsewhere. It was a small moment, but it marked the beginning of a shift in Sophia's perception. What she didn't know at the time was that this small seed of doubt would soon grow into something much larger, something that would shatter the carefully constructed life she thought she knew. On a seemingly ordinary Tuesday afternoon in April, the life Sophia Mitchell had meticulously built began to unravel in the most unexpected way. She had taken a half-day off work, planning to prepare for a weekend dinner party that she and Alexander were hosting. In search of a particular serving platter, Sophia headed into the guest room closet, a space she rarely visited. As she rummaged through shelves, her hand brushed against a small, unfamiliar shoebox tucked away in a corner. At first, curiosity was her only motivation. But when she opened the box, her casual interest transformed into something far darker. Inside, she found a second cell phone, birthday and Father's Day cards addressed to Daddy in what looked like a child's handwriting, and most chilling of all, several photographs of Alexander with a woman and 2 children Sophia had never seen before. Time seemed to freeze as Sophia's mind raced to make sense of what she was holding. Her pulse quickened, her hands trembling as she examined the photos more closely. The images showed Alexander, smiling broadly, with his arm around a brunette woman. Two children, a boy who appeared to be about 7 and a girl, around 5, beamed up at the camera beside him. The background was not a vacation spot or a hotel, but what seemed to be a comfortable suburban home, complete with a backyard. This was no fleeting affair. This was a life Alexander had kept hidden from her for years. The weight of the discovery pressed down on Sophia's chest as the world around her blurred. Was this an old relationship Alexander had never mentioned? Were these children from a past she didn't know about? But the dates on the cards were recent, the most recent Father's Day card only from the previous year. The reality hit Sophia like a tidal wave. Alexander had another family. And worse, he had kept this entire part of his life a secret, all while building a seemingly perfect marriage with her. Desperate for answers, Sophia turned on the second cell phone. It was still active. Her fingers trembling, she scrolled through hundreds of messages exchanged between Alexander and a woman named Rebecca Carter. The texts were intimate, filled with endearing nicknames and discussions of family activities, school plays, doctor's appointments, and vacation plans. Each message pierced Sophia's heart, confirming that Alexander had not just been leading a double life but had been deeply entrenched in this other world. The hours following Sophia's discovery were a blur. With a heavy heart and a mind reeling from shock, she did what anyone in her situation might do. She took to the internet. It didn't take long to track down Rebecca Carter on social media. Although Rebecca's profile was mostly private, Sophia saw enough to confirm her worst fears. There were check-ins at restaurants in Columbus, Ohio, places Alexander had supposedly visited on business trips. There were vague posts about her family, carefully crafted to avoid any mention of a husband. Sophia's fingers hovered over each post, her stomach twisting with each new revelation. Her mind raced back to the numerous business trips Alexander had taken, trips where she had never questioned his whereabouts. She had trusted him implicitly, believing every explanation he had offered for his frequent absences. But now, as she pieced together the clues, the reality became undeniable. Alexander's trips to Columbus weren't for business. They were to visit his second family. Unable to comprehend the scope of the betrayal, Sophia spent hours poring over Alexander's financial records. She had never thought to question the credit card charges before, but now, each transaction seemed suspect. Regular charges in Columbus, meals, hotels, and shopping sprees stood out in sharp contrast to the narrative Alexander had spun. These weren't business expenses. These were part of a life he had hidden from her. It wasn't just the financial records that unraveled the carefully constructed facade of their marriage. Sophia uncovered a second bank account she had known nothing about. There were regular transfers being made to an account in Rebecca's name, further solidifying that Alexander had been supporting this second family in ways Sophia could never have imagined. That night, Sophia sat alone in their meticulously decorated living room, surrounded by the pieces of her shattered life. The home she had once seen as a sanctuary now felt like a stranger's house. Every corner held memories that were suddenly tainted. Every moment of happiness with Alexander was now clouded with doubt. As she looked at the evidence of his deceit laid out before her, Sophia realized that she had been living a lie. And worse, she had no idea what to do next. As the days passed, Sophia found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and an overwhelming sadness. She barely slept, replaying every moment of her marriage to Alexander, questioning everything she had once believed to be true. Should she confront him immediately? Should she seek legal advice? Or should she reach out to Rebecca? Each option seemed overwhelming, each decision fraught with consequences that could destroy not only her life but the lives of others. After days of internal turmoil, Sophia knew she couldn't live like this any longer. She needed answers, and she needed them from Alexander. She chose a Friday evening, the day Alexander was due to return from yet another supposed business trip, to confront him. Every minute leading up to his arrival was filled with anxiety. Sophia rehearsed what she would say, imagining every possible response he might give, but nothing could prepare her for the confrontation that awaited. At 7 p.m., Alexander walked through the door, smiling as if nothing was wrong. But the moment he saw Sophia sitting stiffly on the living room couch, with the shoebox and its contents spread out before her, his smile faltered. His face drained of color as he realized what she had found. "Sophia, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "I know about Rebecca. I know about the kids. I know everything." For a moment, Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and fear. Then, in an instant, he shifted into damage control mode. He walked toward her, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sophia, I can explain. It's not what you think." But Sophia wasn't in the mood for excuses. The weeks of suspicion and the days of agonizing certainty had taken their toll. Her voice rose as she hurled accusations at him. How long had this been going on? How could he have betrayed her like this? Did he ever truly love her, or was their entire marriage a performance? Alexander's responses were a tangled mess of apologies and justifications. He claimed he hadn't meant for it to happen, that he loved both families in different ways. He said he had always planned to end things with Rebecca, but then the children came along, and he felt trapped. He was sorry, so sorry. But as the argument escalated, Sophia noticed a change in Alexander's demeanor. The guilt and remorse that had initially colored his responses began to give way to something darker. When Sophia mentioned going to Rebecca with the truth, Alexander's eyes grew cold, and his voice took on a sharp, threatening edge. "You need to think very carefully about what you do next," he warned. For the first time in her life, Sophia felt a flicker of fear toward the man she had once believed she knew better than anyone in the world. This wasn't the Alexander she had married. This was someone else entirely, a stranger capable of hiding an entire life from her, of deceiving not just her but everyone around them. The confrontation ended abruptly when Alexander, his face contorted with a mix of anger and panic, stormed out of the house. Sophia heard his car peel out of the driveway, leaving her alone in the silence of their home, surrounded by the debris of their shattered life. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Sophia's world collapsed into silence. Alexander didn't return home, and for days, there was no word from him at all. Initially, Sophia believed he had gone straight to Rebecca's house, perhaps to warn her or even to finally make a decision between his two lives. But as the days dragged on, the eerie lack of communication began to weigh heavily on Sophia's mind. There were no charges on their joint credit cards, no calls from Alexander's main phone, and no sign of him anywhere. Her confusion turned into dread. Where was Alexander? What was he planning? Was he with Rebecca, trying to smooth things over and protect his secret life? Or had he simply disappeared for good, leaving Sophia to deal with the wreckage of his lies? The man Sophia had confronted, the one whose face had hardened with threats, was not the Alexander she thought she knew. And now, she realized with growing fear, she had no idea what he might be capable of. Sophia had been living in a state of shock since the confrontation, too dazed and broken to confide in anyone. She hadn't told a soul about what she had discovered, not even her close friends. But now, with Alexander missing and her life falling apart, she realized the secret had grown too dangerous to keep to herself. The longer she kept it, the more isolated and terrified she felt. Alexander's disappearance left her with more questions than answers, and the weight of her fear became unbearable. 5 days after the confrontation, with still no word from Alexander, Sophia decided it was time to break her silence. She reached out to the only person she felt she could trust, Alexander's younger sister, Hannah. Hannah had always been supportive of Sophia, and over coffee at a quiet cafe, Sophia laid out everything she had discovered, from the secret shoebox to the second phone and the messages exchanged with Rebecca. As Sophia spoke, Hannah's face grew pale, her expression shifting from shock to disbelief to horror. When Sophia finally finished, Hannah sat in stunned silence for several moments before insisting that they go to the police. Sophia, still hesitant to involve the authorities and fearing the exposure of their private tragedy, reluctantly agreed. Little did she know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events far more dangerous than she could have imagined. At the police station, Sophia met Detective Samuel Harper, a seasoned investigator known for solving complex cases. Harper was calm and methodical as he listened to Sophia's account of her discovery and the events leading up to Alexander's disappearance. The mention of the secret family immediately raised red flags for Harper, and it became clear that this case was not just a domestic dispute but something far more intricate. The investigation officially began with Harper's team digging into Alexander's financial records, travel history, and the connection to Rebecca Carter. At first, Rebecca refused to speak to the police, clearly shocked by the revelation of Alexander's other life. She had believed Alexander's stories about being a devoted family man who had to split his time between Columbus and Hartford for work. Rebecca had never suspected that he was hiding another entire family from her. As the investigation progressed, more unsettling details began to surface. Harper discovered inconsistencies in Alexander's work records. Some of his supposed business trips didn't match company logs. Financial records showed large sums of money moving through Alexander's accounts in ways that didn't align with his known income. It wasn't just the personal life that Alexander had been lying about. His professional life was also full of deception. The team worked around the clock, piecing together the fragments of Alexander's double life. 2 weeks into the investigation, they made their first significant breakthrough. Alexander's car was found abandoned at a parking garage near Bradley International Airport. Security footage showed Alexander entering the garage, but there was no footage of him leaving. The discovery only deepened the mystery. Had Alexander fled the country? Was he hiding somewhere, waiting for the scandal to blow over? Or had something more sinister occurred? As the investigation into Alexander's disappearance intensified, the strain began to take a toll on everyone involved, most of all, Sophia and Rebecca. The once vibrant, social woman that Sophia had been now retreated into herself, becoming almost a recluse. She stopped attending social events, no longer seen at the corporate galas or neighborhood gatherings she once enjoyed. Every time she left the house, it felt like the world was watching her, questioning her role in the unfolding scandal. The humiliation and betrayal were too much to bear, and she withdrew further with each passing day. Rebecca, too, found herself struggling to maintain a sense of normalcy for her children. Jacob and Emily still didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could sense that something was wrong. The children asked for their father constantly, wondering why he wasn't coming home, why their lives had suddenly been upended. Rebecca tried to keep things together for their sake, but the stress of the investigation, the media attention, and the constant questioning by the police became too much. She eventually took a leave of absence from her job as a pediatric nurse, knowing she couldn't give her patients the attention they needed while her life was in such chaos. For both women, the situation seemed impossible. The man they had trusted and loved had shattered their lives, leaving them to pick up the pieces. Yet as the police uncovered more about Alexander's secretive behavior and potential financial crimes, it became clear that his lies had affected more than just his personal relationships. The full extent of his fraudulent activities was still unraveling, and it seemed as though everyone who had ever been close to Alexander was now living in a state of uncertainty. The investigation had already altered the lives of Sophia, Rebecca, and their families irrevocably. But as the search for Alexander continued, the case was about to take an even darker turn, one that would lead to shocking consequences no one could have foreseen. The deeper the investigation into Alexander Brooks' life went, the more his carefully crafted facade began to crumble. Detective Samuel Harper and his team unearthed financial records that painted a disturbing picture of Alexander's true activities. It became evident that Alexander had been living on the edge of exposure for years. Not only was he juggling two families, but his professional life was also built on deception. Harper's team uncovered inconsistencies in Alexander's consulting business discrepancies that pointed toward fraudulent activities far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. One key witness was Logan Foster, a fellow consultant who had worked closely with Alexander. Logan recalled several instances where Alexander had claimed to be attending client meetings that had never actually taken place. At the time, Logan had admired Alexander's seemingly unmatched ability to bring in new business, but now those successes looked suspicious. As Harper's team interviewed more of Alexander's colleagues, a pattern of deceit emerged. Alexander's business acumen had been, in part, a sham, propped up by fake consulting contracts and falsified documents. It wasn't long before forensic accountants, brought in to untangle the financial mess Alexander had left behind, discovered that he had been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme. Using his position in the consulting world, Alexander had created fake contracts and siphoned money from new investors to pay off older debts, all while pocketing significant sums for himself. This complex scheme had allowed him to live the double life he had carefully concealed for years. It also explained how he could afford 2 households, support Rebecca and the children, and maintain a lavish lifestyle without raising suspicion. For Sophia, these revelations were both a relief and a new source of despair. On the one hand, it became clear that her marriage had been built on lies, financial fraud, emotional betrayal, and deception. On the other hand, the knowledge that she might have unknowingly benefited from Alexander's criminal activities haunted her. She spent hours speaking with lawyers, trying to understand whether she was legally exposed due to Alexander's actions. Though she had no knowledge of his schemes, the money that had supported their life together now felt tainted. Meanwhile, in Columbus, Rebecca faced her own version of this nightmare. The man she had loved, the father of her children, was now the center of a criminal investigation. The life they had built together was unraveling, and every aspect of her relationship with Alexander was being scrutinized. She, too, was questioned by the police, her every financial interaction with Alexander examined for clues about his broader network of fraud. 2 weeks into the investigation, a crucial development occurred. Alexander's car, which had been missing since his disappearance, was found abandoned at Bradley International Airport. At first glance, it seemed like a typical missing person case, someone fleeing a crumbling life and attempting to escape the consequences of their actions. But what detectives uncovered at the scene raised more questions than it answered. Surveillance footage showed Alexander entering the airport parking garage late one evening, carrying a large duffel bag. However, there was no footage of him leaving the garage. The discovery left investigators with 2 troubling possibilities. Either Alexander had managed to slip out of the airport without being detected, or something more nefarious had happened to him. The duffel bag, still in the car, was a grim find. Inside, detectives found Alexander's wallet, cell phone, and a handwritten note. The note's contents sent shockwaves through the investigation. In it, Alexander admitted to his fraudulent activities and expressed deep remorse for the pain he had caused both of his families. His tone was one of defeat and regret, but the final lines were what haunted the detectives the most: "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. It's better this way. I'm sorry for everything." Was this a suicide note, or was Alexander laying the groundwork for yet another deception? The ambiguity of the note left investigators baffled. If Alexander had intended to take his own life, where was his body? And if he had faked his death, how had he managed to disappear so completely? The discovery of the note shifted the investigation's focus from simply finding Alexander to understanding whether he had orchestrated his own disappearance or if something more sinister had taken place. As the search for Alexander entered a new phase, Sophia and Rebecca's lives remained in turmoil. The investigation had already upended their worlds, but now, they were left grappling with the possibility that Alexander might never return, whether dead or alive. 3 months after Alexander's disappearance, just as the investigation seemed to be hitting a dead end, it took a dark and unexpected turn. Logan Foster, the colleague who had spoken to detectives about the inconsistencies in Alexander's business dealings, was found dead in his home. At first, it appeared to be a tragic accident. Logan had apparently fallen down the stairs after a night of heavy drinking. But Detective Harper, now leading a task force dedicated to the Brooks case and its widening circle of consequences, approached the scene with suspicion. There was something off about the position of Logan's body, and the autopsy results confirmed those suspicions. Though Logan was known to be a social drinker, the toxicology report revealed traces of a powerful sedative in his system, one not prescribed to him. Suddenly, Logan's death no longer looked like an accident but a potential murder. The question was why? Who would want to silence him? And what did he know about Alexander's activities that might have made him a target? The timing of Logan's death was highly suspicious. He had been scheduled to give a more detailed statement to the police the very next day, expanding on what he knew about Alexander's fraudulent operations. Theories began to form within the task force. Had someone within Alexander's broader criminal network taken drastic measures to prevent further information from coming to light? News of Logan's death sent shockwaves through everyone connected to the case. Former friends and colleagues of Alexander, many of whom had already been interviewed by police or were scheduled to be, began to look over their shoulders, fearing they might be next. What had once seemed like a scandal of infidelity and financial fraud had now turned deadly. For Sophia, the impact of Logan's death was terrifying. Though she had never been close to him, the realization that someone connected to Alexander's criminal activities had died violently shook her to her core. She installed additional security measures in her home and rarely ventured out, gripped by a growing sense of fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that anyone connected to Alexander could be in danger. Meanwhile, Rebecca, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her children, was equally alarmed. The realization that the man she had loved had not only lied to her but might have been involved in something much darker left her constantly on edge. The investigation was no longer just about uncovering the truth, it had become a matter of survival. The discovery of Logan Foster's suspicious death cast a long shadow over the entire investigation. It wasn't just the detectives who felt the weight of this new development. Everyone even remotely connected to Alexander Brooks began to unravel. The tension became palpable, as fear spread among those who had crossed paths with him, especially those who had spoken to the police or provided information about his fraudulent activities. As much as Detective Samuel Harper and his team were working around the clock to uncover the truth, it seemed that every answer only led to more questions, and every new development pushed those involved further into paranoia. Alexander's sister, Hannah Brooks, was particularly shaken by Logan's death. She had been a supportive figure for Sophia throughout the ordeal, but now her nerves were visibly frayed. Sophia, too, felt the anxiety creeping into every corner of her life. The house, which had once been her haven, now felt like a place filled with ghosts, memories of Alexander, their life together, and the growing realization that she never truly knew the man she had married. Hannah's public meltdown at a local supermarket was a clear sign that the strain was becoming too much. When a cashier accidentally rang up the wrong item, Hannah exploded, screaming at the young woman, convinced that she was being judged or watched. The outburst, though seemingly trivial, was emblematic of the growing fear that everyone felt, fear that they were being monitored, that Alexander's past was still lurking around every corner, waiting to consume them. Meanwhile, Rebecca Carter's life had taken its own tumultuous turn. Her oldest son, Jacob, had been suspended from school after getting into a fight with a classmate who taunted him about his missing father. The children were increasingly struggling to cope with the absence of Alexander, their once stable lives turned upside down by secrets they were too young to fully understand. Rebecca, already emotionally drained, was now balancing the overwhelming responsibility of protecting her children while also trying to manage her own mounting fear that something far worse was still to come. Just as the investigation seemed to be reaching a boiling point, another tragedy struck. Hannah Brooks, Alexander's younger sister and one of the few people who had encouraged Sophia to go to the police, was found dead in her apartment. Unlike Logan Foster's suspicious but ambiguous death, Hannah's murder was brutal and unambiguous. She had been strangled, and her apartment had been ransacked, leaving little doubt that her killer had been searching for something. The news hit Sophia like a physical blow. Hannah had been her closest confidant throughout this entire ordeal, the one person who seemed to understand the complex emotions Sophia was grappling with. Now she was gone, another casualty of the chaos Alexander had unleashed on everyone who had trusted him. The death of Hannah wasn't just a personal loss for Sophia, it was a signal that the situation was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Detective Harper and his team immediately launched a full investigation into Hannah's murder. What they uncovered sent chills through the entire task force. Hannah, it seemed, had been conducting her own investigation into Alexander's activities, driven by a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a need to understand how her brother could have lived such an elaborate lie. Her apartment was filled with notes, files, and documents she had compiled over the months, meticulously piecing together the fragments of Alexander's double life. But the most disturbing discovery was what was missing. Hannah's laptop, which she had used to store much of her research, was nowhere to be found. Investigators quickly determined that her cloud storage had been wiped clean just hours before her estimated time of death. It became clear that Hannah had uncovered something significant, something that had made her a target. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that whatever Hannah had found would never see the light of day. The brutal murder of Hannah Brooks marked a turning point in the case. No longer was this just a tale of infidelity and financial fraud. Alexander Brooks' secrets were beginning to claim lives. With 2 deaths now clearly linked to the investigation, local law enforcement officially handed the case over to the FBI, recognizing that it had grown far beyond their jurisdiction. Agent Diana Collins, a seasoned FBI investigator with extensive experience in high-profile white-collar crime cases, was assigned to work alongside Detective Harper. Agent Collins brought with her a fresh perspective and quickly began to see patterns that had previously been overlooked. What had initially seemed like a case centered around Alexander's personal life, his lies to Sophia, his secret family with Rebecca, was now clearly part of something much larger. As Collins dug deeper into Alexander's financial dealings, it became evident that his fraudulent activities extended well beyond fake consulting contracts. There were links to offshore accounts, and more disturbingly, to organized crime. Alexander's money laundering operation had connections to individuals and networks far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. Collins began to suspect that Alexander had gotten in over his head with these criminal elements, and that Logan Foster and Hannah Brooks had been silenced because of what they knew or what they were about to uncover. The news of Hannah's death sent shockwaves through Sophia's already fragile emotional state. The investigation had already turned her world upside down, but now, with Hannah gone and the FBI involved, Sophia felt as though the ground was constantly shifting beneath her feet. She became increasingly isolated, retreating further into her home, haunted by the realization that anyone connected to Alexander might be in danger. Rebecca, too, took drastic measures to protect her children. She moved them to her parents' home in rural Ohio, determined to put as much distance between them and the chaos as possible. The fear that her children could become targets of this web of crime was too much to bear, and Rebecca's once calm, structured life now felt like a fragile thing on the brink of collapse. As the investigation widened, the connections between Alexander's personal lies and his criminal activities became increasingly clear. What had begun as a shocking tale of a man leading a double life was now spiraling into something far more dangerous, a network of deceit, betrayal, and violence that had claimed 2 lives and threatened many more. Weeks after Hannah's tragic death, the investigation seemed to stall. Despite the best efforts of Detective Harper, Agent Collins, and their team, they were no closer to finding Alexander Brooks. The complex web of his deceit was proving to be a monumental challenge to untangle. Just as hope seemed to be fading, an unexpected break in the case came from an unlikely source. A hiker exploring a state park nearly 50 miles from Millbrook stumbled upon an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The cabin looked like it had been recently occupied, and the walls were covered in old newspaper clippings about Alexander's case. The hiker, spooked by the scene, immediately contacted the authorities, and within hours, Harper and Collins were on the scene. The cabin, though seemingly remote, held critical clues. Under a loose floorboard, investigators found Hannah's missing laptop, which had been wiped clean just before her death. This was the first solid lead they had had in weeks, and forensic experts immediately began combing through the contents of the laptop and the cabin itself for further evidence. It was a breakthrough, but it also raised more questions. Why had Alexander or whoever was involved chosen this location to hide? Was the cabin meant to be a temporary hideout, or had something gone wrong? And most troubling of all, why had Hannah's laptop been left behind in such a careless manner? As the investigation into the cabin intensified, Sophia received a phone call that sent a chill down her spine. It was Alexander. Alexander Brooks' voice, once so familiar, now sounded ragged and unrecognizable over the phone. He told Sophia he needed to see her, that there were things she didn't understand. Against her better judgment, and despite every instinct telling her to refuse, Sophia agreed to meet him. She needed closure, and part of her still yearned for answers to the questions that had haunted her since the day she discovered his double life. The meeting place was an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, a fittingly eerie location for what was sure to be a final confrontation. Despite the fear coursing through her, Sophia tipped off Detective Harper about the meeting, ensuring that the police would be nearby, watching from a distance. As she entered the dilapidated building, her heart pounded, the sense of vulnerability overwhelming. Alexander emerged from the shadows looking nothing like the man she had once loved. He was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his usually immaculate appearance now ragged and disheveled. There was a wildness in his gaze, a mix of desperation and exhaustion. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had happened between them hanging heavily in the air. When Alexander finally spoke, the words poured out of him in a torrent. He confessed to everything: his involvement with a criminal organization, his use of his consulting job as a front for money laundering, and how it had all spiraled out of control. At first, he had been drawn to the thrill and the extra money, but soon he was in too deep to escape. As he talked about Rebecca and the children, his voice cracked. He claimed he had genuinely fallen in love with his second family and had tried to keep them separate from his criminal activities. Sophia listened in stunned silence. She felt a mix of emotions: anger, disgust, pity, and an echo of the love she had once felt for him. But as Alexander rambled on, his demeanor changed. He began speaking about Hannah and Logan Foster, his eyes growing more paranoid with every word. He was convinced that they were coming for him, that nowhere was safe. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, and Sophia realized with a jolt of terror that Alexander was completely unhinged. At that moment, the sound of police sirens filled the air. Alexander panicked, pulling out a gun that Sophia hadn't even realized he was carrying. She raised her hands, desperately trying to talk him down, but Alexander was beyond reason. He waved the gun wildly, shouting that he couldn't go to prison, that everything would be over if they caught him. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds but would replay in Sophia's nightmares for years to come. The police burst into the building, their weapons drawn, ordering Alexander to drop his gun. In a split second of anguish, Alexander turned the gun on himself, a shot ringing out through the factory. Alexander Brooks' final act was as tragic as the web of lies he had spun throughout his life. He survived his suicide attempt but was left in a coma, from which he would never awaken. For many, this felt like a final injustice. He would never face trial for his crimes, never be held accountable for the lives he had destroyed. In the days and weeks that followed the confrontation, the full extent of Alexander's crimes came to light. The laptop found in the cabin provided a treasure trove of information, revealing the intricate web of financial fraud, money laundering, and organized crime that Alexander had been involved in for over a decade. His connections to the criminal underworld were deeper than anyone had realized, and his schemes had defrauded countless victims. With Alexander incapacitated, the criminal organization he had been working with was exposed, leading to a series of arrests. It was revealed that neither Logan Foster nor Hannah Brooks had been killed by Alexander. They had been targeted by members of the organization, desperate to cover their tracks as the investigation closed in on them. The truth about Alexander's fraudulent empire spread through the community, leaving a trail of devastation. For Sophia, the end of Alexander's story brought little solace. Though she was free from his lies, the damage he had caused to her life was irrevocable. She decided to leave Millbrook, needing to put distance between herself and the place where her life had been torn apart. She had no choice but to rebuild, one step at a time, from the wreckage of the life she had once known. Rebecca, too, was left to pick up the pieces. She and her children remained in Ohio, trying to move forward without the man who had betrayed them. The pain of discovering Alexander's deception was something that would take years to heal, and Rebecca knew that their lives would never truly return to what they had been. As the dust settled, those connected to Alexander's story were left to reflect on the truth. Sometimes, the people we think we know best are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. And in Alexander Brooks' case, those secrets had come at an unbearable cost.